Yeah, I think the exceptional character thesis, if we want to call it that, that is present in leadership is also present in ecosystems. Like you do feel that there's some ecosystems where there's just, 3 to 4 people who just are built different and are able to truly kickstart the ecosystem almost by their own. I think I've written about more than 50 countries and their startup ecosystems, especially. And I think I've been one of the only ones to write deeply about markets that haven't gotten any exposure so far. Countries that aren't necessarily associated with tech startups, but that do have tech startup scenes. Yeah, I think we're not too many in that space that have covered them kind of in a deep analytical manner.
For those that haven't realized or don't know, Lex Friedman has been a huge influence on the podcast's format. So I'll use his way of introducing his guests. The following is a conversation with Tim. Tim writes The Realistic Optimist, a paid newsletter covering the global startup world. It was an amazing conversation. I've learned a lot from him on emerging markets. What is it that makes a market help startups thrive? And what are the things that could be done to help them thrive even further? We also spoke about the challenges that startups face in emerging markets, such as devaluations, such as currency depreciations, such as access to global investors. And we spoke about what can be done to really help those startups in those markets. If you enjoyed this conversation, please check out his newsletter and also subscribe to our channel. Thank you so much for coming. I'm personally a huge fan of your work, and we've spoken about this offline. You've really touched me in the sense that you wrote this article about the importance of media in emerging markets. In that article, you were talking about the importance of talking about both the successes and the failure. They're equally as important, especially that in cycles, typically when you're having those booms, if you're just reporting on what's good, if they are no longer doing so great and fall from grace, it has really bad repercussions. And we've seen it in the MENA region, where everyone was talking that everything's fine and great, but it didn't turn out to be as great as being reported at the time. So that was a moment where it made me rethink how much we should be shedding light on both successes and failure. Thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you for the kind words, and thank you for having me, and happy to talk about what I do and why I do it.
Tell me, Tayyib, let's start with what's been Moghamratak, or your journey so far to this moment, and what do you do essentially for those that are not fortunate enough to be reading your Substack?
Well, thank you. So I write a publication, a paid newsletter called The Realistic Optimist. And The Realistic Optimist covers the globalized startup scene. So the thesis is that in the past 10 to 15 years, the tech startup phenomenon has globalized out of Silicon Valley. So you now have tech startups in Iraq, Sweden, Colombia, etc. And my thesis is that the way you do a startup in Sudan, Estonia, Brazil is not the same as in Silicon Valley. And so you need kind of a robust infrastructure, intelligence infrastructure, to understand the complexities of all these new markets where tech startups are propping up. And that's what I write, essentially.
How many ecosystems or startups have you covered until now?
I'd say over 50 national startup ecosystems. Companies, I don't know, but I think I've written about more than 50 countries and their startup ecosystems. Especially, and I think I've been one of the only ones to write deeply about markets that haven't gotten any exposure so far.
Name some of them.
Somaliland, Libya, Iraq, Lebanon, countries that aren't necessarily associated with tech startups, but that do have tech startup scenes. I think we're not too many in that space that have covered them kind of in a deep analytical manner.
You had your own startup back in uni. What was it, and how did it, in some sense, inform the path you took afterwards?
Yeah, so it was a startup called GrowHome. I initially wanted to get into the foreign aid or like international development industry, and I realized that after reading a couple books, that foreign aid essentially created dependencies, and a country cannot rely on foreign expertise nor capital to develop itself. And so the best way is to empower local talent. And what I saw as particularly interesting was, at the same time I was having this realization, tech startups, so local companies led by local founders solving local issues, were propping up around the world. And so I thought, how do you support the rise of these founders and these startups? And my best friend from uni is Palestinian, and so we created a company called GrowHome, which was a platform that connected Palestinian startup founders to mentors and investors in the diaspora. So we did that for about 2 years. For obvious reasons, we didn't choose the most evident first market. But what it taught me was that this recent globalization of the tech startup scene implied a lot of new complexities, because the way you do a startup in Palestine, in Estonia, in Sudan, in Brazil is not the same as in Silicon Valley. And pertaining to diaspora involvement, what I saw lacked was a true understanding of the market. So when we spoke to Palestinian diasporas, they were like, oh yeah, we're interested, but we don't know anything going on. We don't know what the Palestinian startup ecosystem is. And since they weren't informed, they couldn't get involved in a intellectually honest manner. Like, they saw it from afar, there was no information, and so it kind of pushed them back. And so what I saw was a need to create kind of a media intelligence infrastructure that covered this globalized startup scene, so that people from around the world could understand what's happening in other ecosystems and get involved either by investing, expanding their startup there, or just being aware and getting inspired by what happens abroad.
What would you say went wrong with the startup? If you were to summarize the key learnings there, what would they be? Because in some sense, it ties into a larger problem of investing or building something in emerging markets.
Yeah. So there's two problems that were linked. The first mistake we made that I think I mostly push for, not Marwan, my co-founder, I was obsessed with getting investment into the startups that were on the platform. So I was obsessed with getting diasporas to invest in Palestinian startups. But you have two issues. The first, as I spoke about, is that there's very little market intelligence on the Palestinian startup ecosystem. So these diasporas didn't know what they were getting into. And second, the Palestinian ecosystem at that time, and still today, didn't have any exits. It's a very young ecosystem. It's an ecosystem that, for obvious reasons, is crushed by the Israeli occupation. So it's a very, very particular context. But what it means is that there's no proxy of a Palestinian startup doing a Kareem-like exit. And so when you're trying to convince investors, especially in a VC startup context, and they don't have any proxy of how they could exit their investment, the pitch gets much harder. And so what I would have done differently is focus for way longer on the community and media aspect. So really, informing and building the intelligence infrastructure about the Palestinian startup ecosystem, and two, community building. So getting diasporas to talk to local founders, creating relationships, creating mentor-mentee relations that would hopefully organically lead to potentially angel investments, etc. What we did is we put them in touch, and we were like, why don't you invest right now? So I think that was the key learning. And so that's what I do with the Realistic Optimist. I'm kind of taking the other way around. I'm going to be like, I'm going to build a very deep intelligence infrastructure for people to truly understand these markets and get involved in them in a, intellectually honest and comprehensive way.
If you were to summarize the editorial thesis for the Substack, what would it be? so that we can move into and dig deeper into what you've been doing and the findings and the amazing work you've been doing so far.
Yeah, the thesis is that the tech startup ecosystem has globalized. So today, VCs and founders will have to understand what's happening outside of their ecosystems for one or two or both reasons, which is one, business model inspiration. So business models that work in a given ecosystem can work in another if the socioeconomics are similar. So for example, there's a venture studio in Ivory Coast whose entire thesis is we're going to take LATAM startups from Colombia, for example, and like copy paste the business model to the Ivory Coast. Because you can say LATAM is like 5 to 10 years ahead of Western Africa. And so ideally, if we do the business models that work in LATAM here and we kind of adapt them locally, there's a case to be made there. So either business model inspiration or on a more pragmatic commercial point of view, investing opportunities. And once again, with the hindsight of time. So for example, Chinese investors were very involved in the Indian ecosystem at the beginning. Why? Because Chinese investors and the Chinese ecosystem had a lot of similarities with the Indian one. And so Chinese investors could kind of see and make sense of what was happening in India and bet on the right horses. So that was a long-winded answer of saying the tech startup scene has globalized. VCs and founders have to understand what that means. And that's why I write The Realistic Optimist.
In your article, you were saying like it serves three purposes, which I thought was very spot on, which is like adapting to what we know, documenting the playbook for novel challenges, and charting new paths. And it kind of takes the whole cycle, right? Where how do we create those paths and what can be adapted from different essentially ecosystems to what we have now, and then documenting what is going well, what isn't going well, which is a great segue for us to go into, on a macro level, what are the commonalities you see across all of the different ecosystems in the emerging markets?
The one I see all the time, but which is not emerging market focus, is just what happens when a new ecosystem is born, is there's no prior exits of tech startups in that given ecosystem. What does that mean? It means commercial investors don't want to invest because there's no proxy of exit. That's why in the US, the government put a lot of money at the beginning to fund the first VCs. It's what happened in France as well. It's why in a lot of ecosystems, public money funds the first VCs that can then take risks on founders who create the first exit. And so that's a commonality amongst every ecosystem that's young, that doesn't have exits. It's very, very hard to convince commercial capital. And so you have to find ways around it. In emerging markets, if the local government doesn't have the funds to put, that's where DFIs come in. So World Bank, development organizations, etc., with the complicated implications we can talk about. But so that's the commonality I see across every single ecosystem. It's the chicken and the egg problem. You start the ecosystem, founders need investments, but no one wants to invest because no one has exited yet. And so how do you solve that? And that's very interesting to me.
Tell me more about you articulated very well in your publication how France is attempting to do that, and Macron had this ambitious goal of getting 25 unicorns by 2025. They've hit until now 30. What could be learned here for other governments on the French way of doing it?
Yeah, I mean, they went about it in a very French way, which is a lot of state involvement. So France has this thing called BPI France, which is kind of I don't know how I would classify it, almost a public bank. But they've been able essentially to take very long bets on founders, on VCs, with the understanding that their capital is way more patient than a VC fund with 6 to 10 year life. And so I think that's what they've done well in France. Public money has been put, knowing full well that it'll take time to be fruitful, and that initial money is essential for the first founders to get funding, make the first exits, and then make the ecosystem attractive to commercial investors. The public money should be a crutch at the beginning, really to kind of push the first generation of founders, show commercial investors that you can exit in that ecosystem, and then make it easier for commercial capital to see there's a point to invest.
And that's very much how America did it. They did it in a slightly different way, but Silicon Valley was based off of the government's funding, at least in their early phase, funding research that was productized, that then was used for security measures and for the defense industry in the US. And then through that first seed, then you started this new path in what became Silicon Valley afterwards. In Tunisia, for example, they're using a very similar playbook. What do you have to say about the Tunisian experience so far?
I mean, I'm not an expert on the Tunisian ecosystem. I think what's interesting about Tunisia is that they were pretty advanced legislatively, because they did this thing called the Startup Act, which did something I thought was interesting, which is creates specific legislation for tech startups. So define what a tech startup is, define advantages, fiscal or whatnot, that founders could have. But I spoke to the woman who led the Tunisian Startup Act, and what she said was very interesting, which is the Startup Act was great to kind of classify startups, get them going, etc. But now they're having a problem because the startups are graduating and operating in the real economy. And unfortunately, there is kind of the founder's job to find clients, to really grow, to then raise capital that isn't public money. And that's way harder. And so she was saying kind of the phase 2 of the Startup Act is how do we involve the broader Tunisian economy into the innovation ecosystem and engage with tech startups, rather than it being kind of a niche business category of tech startups that do their own thing. No, they need to be integrated into the broader economy. So yeah, I think Tunisia's a pioneer in that matter, but now they've graduated from that and they now operate in the real economy where local corporates might not be super willing to engage. Local talent might not be sufficient. A lot of founders leave Tunisia if they want to raise a Series A, just because it makes more sense. So there's a lot of new questions that the Tunisian ecosystem is facing now that it's kind of done the first step and classified startups, made it a thing, etc.
Do you think it had contributed to the success of InstaDeep, for example?
I don't know how much InstaDeep benefited from the Startup Act. I'm not a expert on that, but I know the InstaDeep founders have been very active with engaging with the Tunisian ecosystem. So even though I think they went to London after their Series A or something like that, they exited for a large amount, and now they're organizing hackathons. I imagine they angel invest in Tunisian startups. So it's kind of this virtual cycle that starts when you get those first couple exits. Once again, it really comes down to the first exits, because those kickstart everything. They kickstart commercial interest, so the government can kind of take a back role. They create a bunch of talent that has startup experience that can either found their own startup or just contribute knowledge to the ecosystem. And if there's an exit in which employees had stock options, it also creates a whole bunch of new local angel investors. So I think the onus to kickstart ecosystem is really how do we foster the first couple of, tangible exits that kicks everything off, essentially.
Yes, and something as well that is fundamental to the success is the legislative aspect of things, where you need the right regulations and regulatory conditions for startups to thrive. And then with one hit, you kind of break out of that vicious cycle. You've mentioned that for them to raise their Series A, they had to go to London. And it's a commonality across a lot of emerging market startups, where for them to raise further, they need to go to quote unquote more developed markets. Why is this the case, in your opinion?
I think it boils down to lack of sufficient local capital. So I don't think there's a lot of Tunisian VCs who can lead a Series A, for example. And then since there's no local capital, you have to raise from foreign investors. And those foreign investors are mostly Western, and they're not comfortable with a legislation they don't know. So if I'm a Tunisian startup, I want to raise a Series A. There's no local VCs that can raise a Series A, so I have to raise from, I don't know, Americans or British. And the American and British investors say, well, we don't invest in a Tunisian jurisdiction. We only invest in the UK or with a Singapore registration or whatnot. So I think it's kind of two interlinked things of there's no local capital, so I have to raise abroad, but foreign capital is only comfortable with very specific types of jurisdictions.
One of the things also that is kind of hard to balance is essentially if you're raising money from international investors, they essentially are more comfortable with models that they're familiar with. So it's very easy to go to, it's much easier to go to an investor that's international and tell them, hey, I want to build the Uber of the Middle East, which then becomes Kareem, rather than something that is localized, that is specific to the region, that they won't necessarily understand as much. And you wrote an amazing article, which is essentially that the first exits typically are going to be copycats. Do you wanna share more about that article?
Yeah, I think copycats is often used as a negative term. To make it simple, as you said, it's a startup in the Middle East. I would say we're going to be the Uber for the Middle East. Some people say that lacks creativity. The way I see it is different, which is if there's a business model that has proved commercial value in another geography for a specific problem, so in the case of Uber, people want to get around faster, easier, there's no reason why you wouldn't try it in your own geography, especially if it's a geography agnostic problem. Like, no one likes to spend time in traffic, so it makes sense to create an Uber for the Middle East and then localize it adequately. And as you said, I think those are the first exits for two reasons. First, it's not a very risky business thesis because it's been proven elsewhere. And second, as you said, it's mostly the models that are able to raise capital because you're raising from foreign money most of the time, and it's a business model they understand. So I never really understood why those types of models were put in a bad light, when I think, once again, coming back to my thesis, the first exits are crucial, and those companies are the most likely, from what I see, to be those first exits and kickstart the ecosystem.
If we go on a macro level, you had touched earlier on startups in Western Africa replicating the Latin American model or copycatting the models there. How do the different, I guess, clusters or regions compare to each other in their maturity? Why is Latin America 10 years essentially ahead of Western Africa? What is it that we're measuring there, if that makes sense?
I think a startup ecosystem development follows economic development. So if you say the Colombian economy is 10 to 15 years ahead of the Ivory Coast one, it's just an example. Logically, both startup ecosystems will be kind of similar in the sense that the Colombian one will be 10 to 15 years ahead of the Ivory Coast one. So I don't think it's a matter of comparing startup ecosystem maturity. I think startup ecosystem maturity follows economic maturity. Like, it's rare to have a very young economy with a thriving startup ecosystem. Most thriving startup ecosystems are in already thriving economies.
Got you. Which is in itself kind of a struggle for the ecosystems, in the sense that founders mostly would, as we mentioned earlier, for their Series A go to more mature markets. And some would argue that this is brain drain. And you wrote another amazing article on brain drain. What are your thoughts on brain drain in general? Is it the right term to be describing the situation in your opinion?
I mean, I think just to clarify on founders going abroad, I think there's two shades of it. Like, one is a Tunisian startup that is operating in the African market, but that will just incorporate in, I don't know, London to make it easier to raise money, be in a jurisdiction, but still continue to operate in Africa. Or, as you said, a Tunisian founder who realizes the Tunisian market just isn't, or they can't make money in it, and so they're going to move to London and sell in Europe. I think those are two different things. And as for brain drain, especially in emerging markets, it is a recurring theme. I think that, and I wrote this with a Moroccan VC, but I think it's not binary. So it's not talent is here, then it disappears abroad and you never hear about it again. There's this term called brain circulation, which I think is more appropriate. Especially in emerging markets, if talent leaves, gains experience, capital, network abroad, that's a fantastic asset. But that diaspora cannot be forced to come back. You can't rely on their goodwill to get involved with the ecosystem. And so the ecosystem has to figure out ways to make it attractive for the diaspora to either invest back home, come back and found a company back home, mentor companies back home. But it has to be in the diaspora's interest. And I think that's what ecosystems like India do extremely well, for example. Today, a lot of Indian diasporas, it would make sense for them to go back to India, or at least compared to 20 years ago, there's more tech opportunities in India. Like, it makes economic sense. And I think that's what ecosystems should focus on. Instead of freaking out that talent is leaving their ecosystem, it's more like, okay, they left, you can't block them from leaving. Instead, how do you leverage everything they're going to gain abroad for the benefit of your ecosystem down the road?
Yeah, and something that you had mentioned in the article, which I find a lot of truth in, is the fact that essentially if you're investing in the diaspora that have ties to their culture still, they would be in some sense involving them. And there's a reason why you have a lot of it. I don't think it's a chance that you have that all of that IT outsourcing to India, where you have a lot of the CEOs of the tech companies of Indian origins. So in some sense, yes, they are not in India, but they're having a big impact on India by essentially training up the people there to, like, more, I guess, to an extent, mature standards, exposing them to real competition. So there's a lot of benefit in that, and something I think we're gonna see more and more of, at least in Europe, is Arab founders involving people back home more. And the reason being, you have that global talent visa, where you have great entrepreneurs that are able to come here and get a UK visa and live here. And essentially, when they're thinking about talent, they just came back. They just came from Egypt, so they know that the level of tech there is great. So if they're building a tech company, they can be hiring great talent at a great price that makes them greatly competitive, which is great. And another thing is the exit, like InstaDeep, right? They still had the Tunisian team, and they were quite involved in it. Yes, they had a team in London, but it elevated the startup as a whole, that they have that cost factor and they're training people in their home countries, which I think is something that we're bound to see more and more of.
Yeah, I also think we have to be more flexible in diaspora engagement. I mean, there's something for everyone. So some will just want to mentor founders back home. Some won't want to get involved at all. Some will want to angel invest back home, and some will even come home and create a VC from scratch for their home market. It really depends. But I think the silver lining is the local ecosystem has to create the incentives for the diasporas to get engaged. So it has to either do actually communications, create fiscal incentives for angel investors, just a whole bunch of things, and make it sensible and logical and even attractive for diasporas to get involved in a whole bunch of ways.
Another option for startup founders is essentially not to raise from international investors, but raise from regional investors. But that can be really hard because in some sense there are regulatory differences between the different countries that are in the same region. And you had spoken about the challenges of a Moroccan startup to essentially expand regionally in the Maghreb region. What can be done, and what are the challenges? First, what are the challenges that the startups face, and from a regulatory point of view, and what can be done in general, so that it's easier for them to go to an investor in the Maghreb area and they would understand why, or not even understand, but what has to be solved for them to have a better case with a Maghreb region investor to invest in them instead of having to go abroad.
Yeah, I mean, I think talking about North Africa, the problem is the region is very broken up legislatively, so there's no kind of unique common market. Some of the VCs in the region told me that, for example, East Africa was kind of a more fluid market where trade was easier. But, I'm not a North African politician, so I don't know. But I know that trade limitations between countries can never help startups who are playing a game of scale, so of large markets, especially in North Africa, where maybe except Egypt, none of the countries making it up are sufficient domestically to create VC scale. So a fluidified trade, I guess, but I'm not in those conversations. But it just doesn't help to have barriers on trade on a startup context.
One of the reasons why you have barriers is to safeguard the local industries. Is there... Where is the balance, would you say, where I'm enacting those barriers, where it becomes conducive or inducive?
It's a good question. I think if you look at the barriers in North Africa, if you figure out which barriers are for political reasons versus protection of domestic industries, I feel like some barriers are probably for political reasons, which obviously are long-winded and complicated, but that don't necessarily obey an economic rationale, I would say. But not a North African politician, so can't dive deeper into that.
And if we were to extrapolate it across like the MENA region, what are the common themes there, would you say, in terms of the struggles that the startups are facing?
It's mostly small domestic markets, which is complicated. If you take Lebanon, Palestine, Jordan, Iraq, obviously the UAE, Qatar, you're going to need to expand very, very fast because the domestic market is far from sufficient to achieve VC level scale, which is the opposite, for example, of a market like India, like the US, like Brazil, who can really just narrow down on their domestic market and still achieve sufficient scale. So the vast majority of countries in MENA have too small of a domestic market to achieve any semblance of VC scale or any semblance of VC traction that would make them able to raise a lot more money. And so logically, facilitating trade between the region and making it more integrated can only help startups.
So if I were to kind of articulate that problem, it's essentially for you to scale, in a country or at least in a region, you either need scale. For you to scale, you either need population or purchasing power. We have that interesting problem in the region where a lot of you have big populations like in Egypt, but they do not have the purchasing power. And then you have the UAE, for example, that has the purchasing power but does not have the population. And what stops startups from scaling is that they don't have that, and for them to surmount that barrier, they need to operate at many countries level, but you have all of those regulations in place. So that's one theme. Are there any other themes across the region that we can explore together as well?
I was talking to an Egyptian VC about this, but I think pertaining to the Middle East in particular, there is this image problem. So there is especially if you consider that a lot of the first wave of VC money in young ecosystems comes from foreign investors, foreign mostly meaning American, Western, so to speak, or sometimes Singapore. The MENA region doesn't have the best reputation abroad. And so what the Egyptian VC was telling me is that a lot of Western investors see the MENA region through an extractive lens. So either as a place to get natural resources, or as we saw with Sam Altman going to, I think, Abu Dhabi or Dubai recently, as a place to raise money to then build in the US. But I think there's a reputational work to be done to prove that there's founders in MENA that can build in MENA, there's markets in MENA. And yeah, if we consider that the first wave of VC funding will be foreign, you will have to convince those foreign investors. And I think the MENA pitch is tough. They have it tough compared to Asia or LATAM. They have it tougher. I think there's a large part of culture in that, especially for American investors. Obviously, I mean, it might seem anecdotal, but the way Hollywood represents the region just does not help. In the mind of, your classic American investor who's never been to the region, if you talk to them about VC in Iraq, the images that come to mind are just very counterproductive to the VC in Iraq raising money. So I think there's a reputational image to change, for sure.
Is that how you see me, Tim?
That's not how I see you.
I guess there are mostly two types of investors that are international, I mean. Private investors and DFIs. Both come with different problems, or they may or may not invest for different problems. For the private investors, unfortunately, in some countries, you have currency depreciations, which really doesn't help the case for investing. And for DFIs, they're sometimes happy to build that ecosystem and pay the bills, essentially. But that comes with an agenda. For the first investor, how do private investors essentially safeguard or hedge against currency depreciation, which is a common theme, not just in MENA, but also in the emerging markets? Yeah,
it's a very, very interesting topic. And I'm taking this from Sturgeon Capital, who I've spoken to many times. And what they say is, because they invest in Central Asia, Bangladesh, so countries where there is currency depreciation. And what they say is that there's two schools of thought of how to handle it. The first is you sell abroad. So you do a startup in, Uzbekistan, but you sell a SaaS to American or a European corporation. So you earn your revenue in more stable currency. And so you kind of dissociate any risk associated with your local currency because you're not selling in it. But that means that the company you're building doesn't really ride any of the tailwinds that a lot of people say make emerging markets exciting. So young population, increasing digital penetration, etc. So you forego currency risk, but you also kind of are not really building an emerging market startup anymore, if that makes sense. Or the second option, which Sturgeon recognizes, is just to grow faster than currency depreciation. And what they say is that if you bet on the right horse in an emerging market with growing internet penetration, that is going to become the absolute leader of industry. So, for example, the startup that will build kind of the leader in African telehealth. If you bet on that startup, on the right one, early enough, and they do actually become the leader of African telehealth, the market is so novel that if they take it all, they should comfortably beat currency depreciation. But obviously, it's a new topic. I mean, startup ecosystems in these countries are very young. So it's two schools of thought to ponder on and to maybe act upon. But obviously, the proxies for success in many of these ecosystems are still either very little or non-existent yet. But that's two ways Sturgeon thinks about how they handle currency depreciation in the markets they invest in.
And in another article, you had mentioned a Nigerian startup where they're essentially building things for diaspora, Nigerians abroad as well. And there could be a lot of learnings there where essentially for basically build for people who are culturally similar to me that can pay me in dollars.
Yeah, no, it's like an interesting mix of both schools of thought in a way. I don't remember the name of that startup, but I think they operate in the content space. So I think they make where they sell subscription to like shows, movies, etc. And it's very smart of them if they can make kind of Nigerian movies that the diaspora is interested in, but the diaspora pays in foreign dollars. It's like a good mix of both doctrines that I just spoke about. So there's ways to go around it, and that's why I think it's so interesting, because founders are coming up with 1,000 different ways to figure it out.
Yeah, and speaking of like this solving for big problems or being the winner, you had also mentioned a Sudanese startup. We're building for the whole market that is very much still behind in terms of the tech that is available in Sudan. What was your key takeaways, or what did you learn from the phenomenal founder?
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to our discussion about copycats. I mean, that founder is building Kashi, which is essentially Sudanese fintech. And it's very heavily influenced by Fowry, which is an Egyptian company that is doing essentially the same thing. So very early Egyptian fintech, allowing people to pay bills in a more in an easier way by going to kiosks, etc. And you're Egyptian, so you could say more about how it works. But what was really interesting to me is that the Sudanese founder got inspired by what happened just north in Egypt, adapted the concept to the local market, and Fowry even invested. And so that goes back to my whole thesis for the Realistic Optimist, is that founders and VCs have a lot to learn from what's happening abroad, because there's no need to reinvent the wheel every single time. It's actually rare. You need to reinvent the wheel. Business models are transposable from geography to geography with intelligent localization. And for VCs, this is kind of a superpower, because if you're a VC, and let's say I was speaking to a guy who runs an incubator in North Macedonia, and he was saying, well, some of the people could be really interested is Polish VCs. Why? Because the Polish ecosystem is like 10, 15 years ahead of the North Macedonia ecosystem. And so those VCs will know inherently what's going to work. Obviously, there's complications and detail, but at the broad strokes is that they'll know what trends are going to take off. So, yeah, I think comparing and reading about different ecosystems, you'll realize that a lot of the problems are the same, and that you can really get inspired from the way founders and VCs are dealing with different markets. And
by spotting the trends elsewhere, you can kind of bet on the right horse. Same way, if Kashi, right, is replicating the same model as Fowry in Egypt, if they grow enough, they can, it's a big market in Sudan, and it's the right horse, and you spot it and it makes sense. I don't know anyone who can just casually mention that they spoke to the North Macedonian.
No, I'm very lucky. But yeah, and to double down on that point, it really goes, I mean, at least my theory is that people's needs are the same worldwide. Like, they want to spend less time on time-consuming and very low value-added tasks. They want to get around faster. They want to be in better health. And so if someone can bring a solution to this problem in geography A, another founder can replicate it in geography B by adapting to the local conditions, but the solution will be relatively similar. So I think people make it out to be more complicated than it is. People around the world want essentially the same things. And so if a founder has figured out how to solve that specific pain point in a geography, another founder can take it, remix it to the local conditions, and then do it locally. I think the best example is Kareem in the Middle East. It's not, they did Uber for the Middle East. It's not revolutionary, but people in the Middle East also want to get around faster and easier. So why not take a business model that worked elsewhere and just remix it to local specificities?
Yeah, and I think people downplay the local challenges. Even if it is a copycat, it is on a high level. But the devil is truly in the detail.
That's why I write The Realistic Optimist. Essentially, ideas can be replicated around the world, but they need to be adapted to local complexities. And those local complexities associated with kind of the macro similarities of business models is what I'm trying to decipher, essentially.
And now that we've covered the private investors, foreign private investors, let's speak more about DFIs. You wrote something that really hit home, and it was really, it was quite funny, at least for me. You wrote. So for context, you created this hypothetical scenario of a founder where they studied at Harvard or MIT. It was MIT. They studied at MIT, and then they go back home, and they want to start a tech startup. Realize they can't really do that, so let's essentially build an accelerator. No one was willing to give them money from the locally in terms of investors, so they had to go to DFIs. And then at the end of the article, you write that after they executed their accelerator, that the event went well, and Zara was asked to sign a bunch of papers with a bunch of BDA officials. Those pictures were posted on LinkedIn. She got a DM from another development agency that wanted to run a refugee tech incubator. Zara wondered what the hell refugee tech was. Do you wanna add more to the story and why this punchline makes a lot of sense?
Yeah, it goes back to what we were saying at the beginning, kind of the chicken and the egg problem of ecosystems. So the first generation of founder needs money, but commercial capital doesn't want to put money because that ecosystem hasn't proven it can exit yet. And so you have two options. Either you take local public money, which depending on the country you're in might not always be either enough or possible. So if you're in France, there's enough money to go around. If you're in a country that's in a situation where they're negotiating an IMF bailout, that might not be their priority. And so that's where DFIs come in, so development finance institutions. It's a very broad term. I think it's pretty ill-defined, but the way I see it is there's two types, either kind of multilateral DFIs, so World Bank, IFC, etc., or bilateral DFIs, which are attached to a state, so the French Development Agency, the Germans, the UK, etc. And so when either in ecosystems with no exits and that are young and that are facing that problem, they often turn to DFI money. Either the first VC, either the first founder, either the first people want to do accelerators, or in it kind of the country's first accelerator, which is the fictional scenario I have in the story. And that's the only capital there is, and so they have to take it. Except if the only option is if there's a visionary diaspora billionaire who agrees to sign off and fund it, but that's rare. So most of the time DFI money comes into play. And I see two issues with DFIs. The first is that tech startups aren't their domain of expertise. So they don't necessarily have the internal expertise to know and to guide these people. And they often want to get maybe involved operationally, which if they don't have the expertise is doomed to create tensions. And second is that money, since it's state money, public money, quote unquote impact money, often comes with strings attached and objectives that aren't related to the needs of the ecosystem at that moment, but more related to the goals of the state funding that development agency. So for example, in Tunisia, there's a bunch of climate tech accelerators funded by the German government. And you kind of wonder, is this really the priority? Climate tech? Is climate tech accelerators what the Tunisian ecosystem really needs, or is it what the German government wants to be seen doing abroad? And I've spoken to VCs, notably, in Pakistan, who got money from these DFIs and who said, well, we're in it for commercial gain. We're trying to fund high growth tech startups. And the money from these DFIs is coming with strings attached that either slow us down, are way too heavy for the stage the companies are at, or that are just not related to the financial success of the company. So yeah, I think that the strings attached and the lack of, pure tech startup competency that these DFIs have creates issues. But then again, in many ecosystems, that's the only source of money available. So there's no point in being super rash. It's more of making DFIs understand how to better refine their positioning to actually support the startup ecosystem that they want to support.
You spoke about how essentially they were given like $500,000 and
$5,000.
But in the end they wanted to fund, instead of the mandate was to fund 100 essentially different startups, quote unquote startups. So it was 5,000 each, which really isn't enough at all to kickstart anything. But they wanted to fill in that mandate of, we've helped 500 different entrepreneurs or 100 different entrepreneurs in the region that were female, that were also from disadvantaged backgrounds, which really is very hard to do in those countries, or in our region at least at this point in time.
Yeah, I think the nature of the goals isn't necessarily problematic. You can't say that helping underserved communities is a bad thing, but the problem is that their KPIs are dissociated from the ecosystem's true needs. As I said, if it's a young startup ecosystem, what it really, really needs is first exits, because it needs exits to show commercial potential and stop relying on public money. And it feels like DFI's objectives are not those first exits. They're impact objectives, blah, blah, blah. But that's not what the ecosystem needs at that point in time. So there's a misalignment of KPIs, which I think slows some ecosystems down, and from the conversations I've had, creates a lot of frustration.
The most, I guess, disadvantaged startup ecosystems are the ones that were inflicted by terrible circumstances, of which they had wars or mainly a lot of civil wars. It's been the case in Iraq, where they had a lot of problems, conflicts there. Also Libya, and you have actually spoken to founders from there. What's your hope that we'll be able to to build ecosystems in those countries? What's the silver lining there?
What I'm trying to do is demystify these ecosystems. Because when I spoke to the Libyan founder, the Iraqi VCs, what they were saying is, once again, they face the same problem of young ecosystem, no exits, so no commercial capital, no local capital, so they have to go abroad. And the problem they run into is reputation. Libya obviously has a bad reputation, Iraq has a bad reputation, and obviously those are tough places to build businesses in. The case is not to say everything is wrong, Iraq and Libya are rosy, and it's a great place for tech startups. What I'm trying to do is deeply transmit the intricacies of those markets so that investors and VCs who want to learn about these markets actually have a good overview and then decide if they want to go in or not. But I think it's a bit lazy to just say no because it's Iraq or no because it's Libya. I think there's deeper layers to this. And obviously for markets like this, the percentage of investors that will want to take that risk is tiny, obviously tiny. But I think that by shedding light on it in an intelligent manner, so really deeply explaining what's happening there, investors can better understand the true nature of these markets and make informed decisions about whether to go or not, but not stop at, oh, it's Iraq, so no.
I guess it's building a foundation in terms of data points. They're not completely blind. If they at least have a complete picture that is not based on first instinct bias.
Of course.
Yeah. You were, when you were speaking to the Libyan founder, he said that maybe what makes more sense for our region, or at least in emerging markets, is more of a private equity model rather than a VC model. What was he trying to say there? And what if you were to steelman his argument, what would it be?
I mean, what he was saying, and it's his opinion, he's so much better versed than me on these topics, and that's the point of my publication, is to transmit what people who really know what they're talking about think. I'm kind of taking a back role and just transcribing it. But what he was saying was the markets he operates in have too low of a buying power to create VC grade returns. And so trying to pitch a VC and say, oh, we'll get to X $100 million valuation is not possible because the people he's selling to don't make enough money, and so the multiples just don't make sense. But there's pros and cons. I mean, I sent the article to one other African founder who said, well, that's not true because you can start with, in his case, he's doing, I think, food delivery, ride hailing, and kind of early fintech. And what he was saying, the other guy was saying, well, actually, if you can do a super app and become the super app for Africa, it doesn't matter if the buying power is low, if you can get a ton of people to use it, and then the multiples make sense. But yeah, it's interesting. And that's one of the things I say, like, the other point of the publication is to chart new paths, or at least understand how founders in these markets are dissociating from the Silicon Valley playbook, or at least adapting it to their context. Because I think at the beginning of the interview you said, there was a lot of hype and then everything went, or shit hit the fan. But I think that it was more of a brutal copy-paste of Silicon Valley mentality, and then a realization that, oh, it's not the same markets. Like I was speaking to a Pakistani VC who was telling me this, who was telling me, well, a lot of the very well-funded startups in Pakistan failed, or at least one big one, Airlift, failed after, I think, funding went down because they couldn't raise a following round. And what she was saying was the problem there is that they raised money and they operated the company as if they were in the Bay Area, where they could have continued to raise money. But, they were in Pakistan, and funding ecosystem was dependent on foreign capital, who, once they decided to retreat, there was no one else to fund their round. But to go back to what you were saying, I think yeah, the point of the publication is also to explore the complexities of these new startup ecosystems, and in many cases document the new playbooks that are being written. Like you were talking about currency depreciation, that isn't really an issue that has been faced by Silicon Valley founders. Same for brain drain. If anything, Silicon Valley's been the opposite. They've just imported so many brains.
They are the brain drain.
Yeah, they are the brain drain. But so, if you're a founder in a ecosystem with currency depreciation, brain drain, low buying power, the classic American startup literature isn't necessarily helpful because they haven't faced those problems. And so one of the questions I'm trying to answer is, what are the playbooks, the novel playbooks that founders in these markets are devising for these specific problems?
I'll play devil's advocate here. We have a very similar view and vision that tech is an answer to many of the problems in the region and for us to leapfrog, essentially, at least in emerging markets. But if we look at the history of the US, if you look 40, probably 50 years ago, most of the richest people that were in those countries, or at least in the case in the US, they were very much either industrial, or they were car manufacturers, etc., or they were going to be banks. That was very much a common theme. And then they've built out this, I guess, path where then, you had that government helping, and then the whole tech boom, and you had a lot of billionaires that amassed their wealth from tech. And emerging markets were still not even there yet in terms of manufacturing. So if we take like the cycle of China, they started with manufacturing, and it wasn't very complicated things to begin with. It was very simple. And then it became more and more complex down the line. And then they started investing in really high tech, where they're now competing in AI with the US, and they've pretty much caught up. So do you think, and that's a question for me as well, right? Do you think that we can truly leapfrog and avoid that cycle, or that regular, not regular, but until now has been the orthodox trajectory, or not?
I don't know, but what I know is that there are counterexamples to that, namely in very small countries. If you take Estonia, Singapore, they moved on pretty fast to very high intellectually tech or financial value-added services and exporting that. For a large country, I don't know, but for a small country, there are examples of countries that kind of leapfrogged the manufacturing and just went straight into very high value-added tech industries. I think Estonia is probably the best example.
How do you think population plays a role in this? Apart from obviously if you're, training 500,000 people, it's different than, training up 50 million people. It's much harder. But what else makes it a lot harder for countries to leapfrog apart from population? I'm thinking out loud, by the way. That's more of the exploratory phase of the interview.
But leapfrog in terms of
become Singapore, essentially.
So why do some countries struggle to become Singapore?
Apart from population size, and I guess also what about population size that makes it harder? It's the effort, but it is to an extent proportional, right? So if you have to, I don't know, you're 500, you have a 5 million, your population size is 500 million. Proportionally, I don't know, 5% are training them, so that's 250,000 individuals that are training those 5 million. Just a very stupid example.
Yeah.
So proportionately, you should be able to do that at larger scales, I guess. What is it?
It's very hard to predict too. You sometimes have exceptional individuals prop up, and you don't really understand why they've propped up here rather than there. But yeah, I think it does really boil down to singular quality of leadership. And some countries have been lucky enough to have visionary leaders, others just haven't, and others also suffered external interference, other issues. But yeah, it just seems to boil down a lot to who is your leader post-independence in the case of emerging markets.
You've been doing this now for the past 2 years, and we've spoken about exceptional leaders. You've spoken to many people. Tell me more about the exceptional individuals and founders that you've spoken to so far.
Yeah, I think the exceptional character thesis, if we want to call it that is present in leadership is also present in ecosystems. Like, you do feel that there's some ecosystems where there's just 3 to 4 people who just are built different and are able to truly kickstart the ecosystem almost by their own or on their own. I think in many of the ecosystems I cover, the first VC or the first founder are very, very impressive because they're really doing it against all odds. Like the Libyan founder is very impressive, like essentially building, put it very simply, like Uber Eats for Libya in a country where obviously no foreign VC wants to ever step foot. Iraqi VCs who are kind of pioneering the ecosystem and trying to raise with obviously the companies or the country's difficult reputation, even founders in those ecosystems. So yeah, really first movers in the ecosystems I cover are all exceptional because they could all be working for McKinsey in London. Like, they all have the intellectual capabilities, clearly, but they've chosen to go back home and either build the first startup, build the first VC painstakingly. And then in terms of founders and exceptional founders, I mean, I published an interview last week with a founder in Ghana who's building a company called M Pharma. And what we spoke about is how do you create or how do you build health insurance, private health insurance for people on $2 a day. And just the way he goes about it and his company goes about it is remarkable, like intellectually very, very, it's very deeply thought. And once again, it's part of that novel playbooks that I'm trying to document. So, people in Silicon Valley don't have to build health insurance for people on $2 a day because there aren't many of them. People in Silicon Valley don't have to build health insurance in a context where the local currency is dropping. And yeah, the way that founder is going about it is just...
Tell me more about how he's going on about it.
Yeah, I mean, the interview does it justice more, but essentially what he does, I hope I'm not butchering the concept here, but his big thesis is on pharmacies. So he thinks that by empowering local pharmacies, making them more efficient, and turning them into really primary healthcare centers, you can, almost not replace, but be a substitute to hospitals that can be overcrowded, and a more efficient way of delivering care for less serious injuries. But the way he does his health insurance, I mean, he explains it better than me, but essentially he franchises or owns a bunch of pharmacies, so he gets a whole bunch of buying data on what people are buying at these pharmacies. From there, he's been able to extrapolate the 14 diseases for which people come in most often. And from there, he's been able to determine how much it costs on average to provide care for those 14 diseases. And from there, craft a reasonable price for health insurance that covers those 14 diseases. And it's fascinating because it's really novel. It's really, really, really novel. And it's really building business models in completely new circumstances than the traditional Silicon Valley literature.
You mentioned many times on this episode, it's very challenging for him because mostly people who invest, foreign investors that invest in Africa or DFIs, and, or they're big organizations that are, just funding one thing to, I don't know, eradicate within healthcare polio or AIDS or malaria, but anything else just doesn't get covered.
Yeah, I mean, his thesis is that the African healthcare system has to be market-driven, just as other well-performing healthcare systems are, or at least have, an active private sector component. And what he's saying is that philanthropy in Africa in the healthcare space has often been focused on a single disease, when African patients, just like every other patient on earth, has a wide variety of diseases, and you can't have a healthcare system that works for A, only specific diseases, and B, is dependent on donors' presence, because when priorities shift, donors leave and the infrastructure crumbles. And so his entire fight is, building commercially driven healthcare infrastructure in Africa, which is tough because market conditions are tough. But that's what he sees as the price of independence and sustainability of the healthcare system long term. And that's why, going back to the very, very beginning of the story, why I chose to get into this space rather than international aid, because I think there's nothing more inspiring and sustainable and impactful long term than local founders building local companies with solutions to local problems and employing local talent. I mean, I don't really see how a country can develop under profusion or like in a complete relation of dependency with foreign skills and foreign capital.
And also government provision with essentially no private market to back it. So if the government faces any issues, or the international donors or the organizations pull out, it's absolute chaos.
Yeah, if you have no private sector and the people.
Do you have examples of when shit hit the fan in healthcare?
What he was saying was he was speaking to Ethiopian pharmacists who were telling him that the Ethiopian government had highly subsidized insulin, I think it was, so specific drug for diabetes, I think,
yes.
And that they subsidized it so much that it made it illogical for private actors to compete because the government subsidized insulin was just too cheap, and so they couldn't compete. But when the government faced currency crunch and didn't have the money to buy and subsidize the insulin, A, there was no more insulin, and two, there weren't any private manufacturers, actors that produced the insulin, and so there's just no insulin at all, no alternatives. So what he's saying is markets in healthcare, and at least I think I'm paraphrasing right, but create less or avoid a single point of failure, which is the case if it's only government driven or only donor driven. If the funder dies, everything crumbles.
Man, the amount of amazing examples in your publications are incredible. So that honestly, I've learned a lot studying for this episode. You chose quite a specific model for the publication, where it's subscription based, and I highly recommend anyone who's listening to this to subscribe to it and pay. Why did you choose that model that you've chosen?
Yeah, it's more than subscription based. It's subscription only. By subscription, I mean paid subscription. So it's $12 a month or $100 a year. And the reason I chose that is two reasons. First, to guarantee complete editorial independence. So I think a lot of startup media, if it's based on sponsors, logically they're going to attract sponsors that are in the startup space. And or thus they could be restricted in the things they can say because someone else is feeding them. If you're funded by your readers, you can say whatever you want. The only thing you have to make sure is that your readers gain value. And I think the media game and media business model is really a game of incentives. And if your business model is sponsors, the incentive is that the sponsor is happy and continues to buy placements in your publication. And I don't think that's necessarily the healthiest way to go about it. And with paid subscriptions, the only incentive I have is that my readers are satisfied by the quality of the content I put out and that they pay for. And I think that's a good standard to have. Like, that's the only thing I care about, is that my readers are satisfied enough to continue paying. Yeah, I think that actually that summarizes it pretty well. And the other reason is I didn't see a lot of media publication in the space that had that kind of business model. So there's a great publication in France called Mediapart, whose business model I'm in love with. Massive inspirations. I think they're the second or third biggest media company in France, and their business model is very simple. It's all paid subscriptions. So I think it's 99% of their revenue is paid subscribers. They have, I think, over 250,000 subscribers, compared to a lot of the other media publications in France who are A, owned by billionaires, and B, funded by ads, at least in part. And what that has given Mediapart is a way larger freedom of expression, editorial freedom, to really talk about the topics people don't necessarily want to hear, but that are very important to the preservation of kind of a healthy and dynamic society. So they're often the ones breaking political scandals, covering economic scandals, and they have a truly unique liberty of tone in how they cover the topics they cover, which I think is super interesting, and what I want to replicate, because I think, in startup media, if you're funded by the sector you're supposed to cover, that isn't necessarily conducive to the most incisive. I wouldn't call it journalism, what I'm doing yet. It's more analysis, but it's not conducive to the most incisive journalism you can do. Like the piece about impact, which is honestly a satirical piece about DFIs. Like if a DFI was funding my publication, I don't know how they would have felt about that. I can't say they would have blocked it because I don't know. They probably wouldn't have felt super good about it. But the fact that I'm based on, or my model is based on paid subscribers, allows me to say really anything I want, which I think is needed in the startup ecosystem.
If I were to push back a bit on the business model, it's $12 a month, $100 a year. It's focused on emerging markets. It could be a lot for people there. It could be accessible for international investors. But let me tell you that $100 for someone is a lot in Egypt. How do you think about that?
It's step one. I live in Europe, so I have a European cost base. So I can't do Egyptian pricing if I live in Europe, obviously. I also think objectively a lot of the people who read me have the means to pay. If they're an Egyptian VC who's raised, I don't know, $40 million for a fund, they can pay $12 a month. If they're a founder who's raised over $1 million, they can pay $12 a month. An Egyptian university student who's interested in startups, it's way harder. Hopefully, I can get to a point where I can subsidize those readers. Going back to what I was saying about the Mediapart in France, they started at $12 a month, but now they have, I think, a half price discount for students. So I'd love to get to that point, but I have to be pragmatic. And today, I think there's a significant amount of readers in these markets that work in this sector and that do have the means to pay. So, yeah, it's a two-step process.
Maybe you can explore something where, if a reader really wants to, access it for free, they can shoot you an email, and you can just check in every year once, like, hey, are you still not able to pay this? Which is, I think, is a really cool model, because in some sense, money should not be an issue for knowledge in and it should be as much as possible democratized. And if the average person, I think, is honest, and if they have to kind of opt in to get it for free, I think they would happily do that until they can pay for it.
No, there's definitely models to explore. I think that's a good one. I think it's a good way to potentially tap DFI money. So if DFI money can bulk buy subscriptions for people in the accelerator they're running, I think that's interesting. There's ways for organizations that can pay to subsidize subscriptions for people who can't pay. So obviously it's a challenge. It's something I'm deeply thinking about too, because as you said, I do have a significant amount of readership in emerging markets. I do think that today most people who read my stuff can't pay because they're working for VCs or startups that are funded in dollars and thus can't pay. But it's not an ideal situation yet because there is still a high premium on buying it. But hopefully with scale, those problems will kind of assuage themselves.
What have you sacrificed so far to pursue this journey?
Growth takes way longer. It takes way longer to convince people to pay, which is normal. It takes way longer to grow because my content isn't free, it's paywalled. So obviously distribution is longer. And the other thing that this isn't necessarily related to business model, but I've taken a very global geographical scope from the beginning, which means I have a very, very globally dispersed readership. So I've, my Stripe tells me I have readers in like 40 countries. And what that means is that network effects within the audience are hard to create because these people don't necessarily hang out together. Whereas if you wrote a newsletter for gym owners in London, all of them hang out or they know each other, and so the word gets passed rapidly. But since my scope is completely global, I have a very dispersed audience, and so when you ask what I sacrificed, I'd say speed of growth, but I'm in it for the very, very long term, so not too worried.
Yeah, and that definitely is a sacrifice, and I think with these things it's not very linear, right? It's becomes at some point exponential because you have
That's
all of
what
these
I hope.
people.
That's what I'm hoping for.
I really think it's just a function of time. What are the sacrifices that you've also done beyond just the business model, where you're a smart guy, you went to one of the best schools in the US, and you could have been working at McKinsey or doing something else? What are the sacrifices you've made? How are you living your life now based on that decision?
I don't really see it as a sacrifice because the alternative is just draining to me. Maybe it's arrogance, but I place a super, super high premium on my life, which I think is very short. And I'm very lucky to have, the social position, the financial backing, and the youth that enables me to be able to survive by doing what I love. There's just, I can't accept that someone else decides how I spend my time. I really want to spend it on, or I only allow myself to spend my time on my convictions and what I think is useful. And I place a very high premium on that. So yes, I could be working at McKinsey, but I'm pretty sure most of the time I'd be working on something I'm not fully convinced is useful. And I have a allergic reaction to working on stuff that I don't see the point of. I think my ex-boss at my old French startup, that was one of my peer reviews, which was, I always asked why I was asked to do something and the reason behind it. I just can't, I can't work on something if I don't see the point. I just can't. So I figured a good way is to work on exactly what I want and what I want to build.
And you've had some tough times, right? Like closing down GrowHome and, quitting your job that, provided an income, and choosing to live with your parents. Times can be rough, I guess, for you. How do you maintain your mental health and make sure that you're staying afloat?
I mean, it's all relative. Like the tough times I have objectively not that tough. Like, especially when you cover the markets I cover, there is a hierarchy to gravity of problems. And the problems I face, which are more challenges, they're not that hard to take in because they're all chosen. So I chose to do GrowHome. I chose to quit my job. I chose to write this. Yeah, my dad always says it's one of the signs you have a great life is if you only have problems that you chose. And all the problems or challenges that I have are completely chosen. So I honestly can't really complain. Like, I'm doing something I love. I'm lucky enough to be able to live from it. And yeah, what keeps me going is just a pure conviction that the globalization of tech startups can bring immense societal economic progress, but that can only happen if we have very deep, pragmatic, rigorous media infrastructure that truly explains what this means, that asks the right questions, the uncomfortable ones sometimes. But yeah, I'm pretty convinced in what I'm doing, not stopping anytime soon.
Yeah, I hope you really don't stop. And with pragmatism, I think a word that is quite associated to it is realistic. So, and I mean, you're quite optimistic as well. So you've chosen the perfect name for the Substack, the Realistic Optimist.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, like, I only agree to, I can only work on stuff I'm deeply convinced about. I think by nature I am a realistic optimist, so I don't. The opposite of optimism sounds unbearable to live with, but I think you can justify your optimism if you're truly trying to find rational solutions to the problems you're facing. And so yeah, the realistic optimist really encapsulates how I view life and the things I'm trying to transmit through the publication.
You've covered a lot of macro things, macro issues. What are the next focus points for you as a publication?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, the macro issues, we talked a lot about them in this interview. I think I'm at 120 pieces now, which are mostly macro, and the same themes always come up. And I think I've really done the rounds on that. And so I'm going to be focusing way more on in-depth written founder interviews with founders around the world, from Poland to Colombia to Somaliland, whatnot, and really dive deep into how they operate. Really, the key word is operate. How do you operate in these markets? And the first version of that is that interview I did with M-Pharma founder in Ghana, who raised, I think, $35 million and is building, healthcare, private healthcare insurance in difficult markets. And the goal is to transcribe how they're doing this.
I honestly wish you the best of luck, and I'm really, really excited for what comes next. I'm a big fan, and for the probably fourth or fifth time, I highly recommend everyone listening to this subscribe. Thank you for all you're doing, and you're doing your rounds to really grow that media within the ecosystem to cover the great things and the bad things that are happening.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for giving me a platform, and thank you for doing this podcast.
One of many for you, inshallah. To be hosted on Moghamra.
Perfect. Thank you so much.